Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. This is a recording of our weekly Exploring the Parasha class with Rabbi Rebecca Schatz and Rabbi Matt Shapiro.
Hi, everybody. You are going to get two guest teachers today. Rabbis Shapiro and Schatz, I think, thought that it would be funnier if you didn't know that you were getting Rabbi Kligfeld and me instead of the two of them today. So surprise, happy Adar, Chodesh Tov, V'nahafochu, flipping things around. You have a couple of different rabbis, and we are primed to do a Parsha podcast. We still know Torah. We're still two rabbis, and I don't know. I think you should be welcoming us, maybe, and not us welcoming you. It sounds like you all are a micro community who's been at this for a while. So,
well, welcome, Rabbi Chorny and Rabbi Kligfeld.
Thank you. Thank you for taking that so seriously. I really appreciate that. V'nahafochu, right? So we're in it.
Yes, I want to welcome you as well.
Oh, thank you.
But do you really know what this?
It's a 52-minute meditation, right? That's what we prepared.
No.
Oh, okay. No, we know. We're good.
The two of you can. Okay. Hey, you know what?
I was definitely planning on doing stand-up. So is that about par for the course?
Yeah,
sorta. Yeah. Okay.
There's a lot of interaction between the two rabbis that are usually on them.
Oh, well.
And I mean, I don't mean, and I mean interaction in
the loosest sense of the word.
I'm so glad we're recording this. I look forward to sharing with them. Well, I do like Rabbi Kligfeld a little bit. I think he's pretty cool. So,
good job.
We can have repartee. I just don't know how witty it'll be. But we are prepared to talk Parsha. So we're in Bereshit. Wait, no, that can't be right. No, we're about to end a book, actually. So we're at Pekudei, and I think Rak is going to kick us off with some Pekuding of Pekudei.
I will Pekud as best as I can. I love Pekuding. Let me pull up a screen here. Tomorrow morning's bar mitzvah boy, Matthew, is basically starting his drash by making a joke about dry humor and dry parshas, and sometimes the parshas that seem to be the most dry are the ones that have the most exquisite pearls in them. I did not feel that way in October of 1999, when all of the members of my rabbinical school class got our assignments for our senior sermon, because every rabbinical student gives us a sermon, as a capstone project. And, my friend got Yitro, 10 Commandments, and someone else got something in the Joseph story. And I got Pekudei, which meant that my culmination of rabbinic studies was going to be about cubits and screens, and planks and tanned skins. Pekudei is part 2 of a double parsha, which is not always doubled, but this year it happens to be. This is a leap year. Leap year, if you just do quick math in your head, reduces the double parshas because you have more weeks in the lunar year, because it's a 13-month lunar year, to get through the parashot, right? So if you have more weeks in that year, then you're going to need a parsha to read in those weeks, and it's a very elegant system. So there are no double parshas this year, but there are fewer double parshas than there would be in a normal year. And one of the parshas that often turns into 2 single parshas in a leap year is Vayakhel and Pekudei. Vayakhel and Pekudei are basically sometimes almost verse for verse, with just the tense and the form of the verb changing, duplicates of Parashot, Truma, and Tetzaveh from 2 weeks ago, from 2 and 3 weeks ago. Parshat Truma and most of Tetzaveh are God telling Moses to tell the Israelites, this is how you should build the Mishkan, the tabernacle. Then we have Kitisa in the middle, and I actually spoke about that last week in my sermon, one read as to why the golden calf is right in between. And then in Vayakhel and Pekudei, in a way which is very odd for a text, which is very terse, right? The whole story of the binding of Isaac is 19 sentences. And yet we have dozens and dozens and dozens of verses, including in Vayakhel and Pekudei, which basically say, remember what God said to do in Teruma and Saba? They did it. But each and every one, right? That making the curtain this cubits, they did it. Making the square this size, they did it. So there's a lot of repetition that makes for either really hard Torah reading because there are so many verses that are not storytelling, and it's always harder to read verses that are not storytelling. But in some ways it's easy because if you know Vayakhel, if you know Teruma and Tetzava well, then you can learn Vayakhel and Pekudei well because it's very similar words, very similar truck.
So what you're saying is it's the original Deuteronomy.
It's the original Deuteronomy, correct. If everyone doesn't get the joke, Deuteronomy meaning like the second telling, the second law, which by the way is also the rabbinic nickname for the book of Deuteronomy is Mishneh Torah. Mishneh, the second, like Shnayim Torah, which is what Maimonides very intentionally named his book of Jewish law. He called it the Mishneh Torah because he basically thought that what he was writing in the 12th century was the second coming of Torah, right? If you couldn't really get through the details of Shra, just read my book and you'll know exactly what to do in Jewish life.
Yeah, no ego on that guy.
No ego. So most of Pekudei is what I just described, and we're not going to look at that at all. We're going to look at the real juicy, wonderful 4 or 5 verses that end the Parsha, because it's such an interesting departure from the architectural details that lead. So if you see here in verse 33, Vayakom et hachatzer, he set up the courtyard, the closure, Saviv LaMishkan, around the tabernacle, VeLaMizbeach, and around the altar, Vayitain et Masach Shar Chatzer, put up the screen that was going to be at the gate of that area. And then these words, Vayachal Moshe ad Hamelacha. He finished the work. By the way, that Vayachal Moshe ad Hamelacha is probably very intentionally evocative of how the first chapter of Genesis ends, which is Vayachulu Hashemayim v'haaretz, right? So God finishes creating the world with this root kal, kaf lamed, like a complete, like a kol. And then Moshe, God's servant, completes God's home on that earth that God had created with a similarly constructed sentence. Vayachal Moshe et Hamelacha, finish the work. You see that pay here? That just tells you there's a parsha break. So if you're reading the Torah, like this is where someone would have pressed return on the typewriter, and the next paragraph begins the beginning of the line. This would have been a really interesting place to end the Parshat Pekudei and to end the book of Exodus. The work of building God's home on earth was done, but there are 4 more verses, and those are the verses that we're going to focus on. So I'm just going to read through them and try to give as little commentary to them as possible because I want them to speak for themselves, but I'll demystify just some of the words for you. Then Rabbi Chorny is going to kind of take your temperature and get a sense of what your reactions to them are, and then we'll come back and offer some of our own interpretation. Vayachas Anan et Ohel Moed. The cloud. What cloud? This is not an environmental image. This is a divine image. The cloud of glory that was present for the Israelites at times during the wandering in the desert. Chas, covered, at Ohel Moed, the tent of meeting. Uchvod Adonai, and the presence of God, to suggest that whatever the Anan is, the cloud, it is not coterminous with the presence of God. It is something different then, because otherwise you wouldn't have had an and in there, right? It doesn't say the cloud, which represents the glory of God, covered the Ohel Moed, but the cloud covered the Ohel Moed, and the glory of God. And just if we can drill down on glory, and those people who are in my Rashi class know they do this all the time, there's no such thing as a simple translation of any Hebrew word to any English word, certainly across thousands of years. So we can translate kvod as glory or honor because that's one of the ways we do it, but that's not necessarily what it means. Or to say it on a meta-linguistic level, the brain image that you have unconsciously when I say glory or honor may not be the brain image that an ancient Hebrew speaker would have had when they heard the word kavod, and there's no way of resolving that. Kvod is also related to the root kaf bet dal, which means heaviness, something of substance. So anan is diaphanous. It's a cloud. Kvod, Adonai, is in some ways the non-diaphanous, the non-airy presence of God, something of mamash, something of realness. So that aspect of God, malay, filled the Mishkan. Okay? So if you want to try to imagine it, the Mishkan is the larger structure, and God's like full kavod and glory is everywhere, right? Almost like I don't know why this is the image that comes to mind, but like there are these things called spray insulation, where if your walls are too thin, you can open a wall and stick a hose in there, and it sprays insulation, and so now there won't be sound traveling from one room to the next. Like it fills all of the area, right? Or I don't know, when you tent a home for termites, right? So every cubic inch of the area is filled with the thing. Kvod Adonai was everywhere in the Mishkan, and in addition to that, the cloud was over one part of it, the tent of meeting. Okay, that's verse 34. V'lo yachol Moshe lavo el moed. We hear something which I consider to be, at least at first glance, very odd. Moses was not permitted to enter the Ohel Moed, this tent of meeting, one of the inner chambers of the Mishkan, ki shachan alav hanan, while the cloud was there. So Moshe builds a house for God. When God is present there in the cloud, Moshe can't go in. And when God's presence, kvod Adonai, when the heaviness of God is filling the Mishkan, Moses is staying on the outside, right?
Can I ask you a question, Rabbi Kligfeld, on the shot of that as you're getting through the grammar?
Yeah.
Because I happen to agree with you on something. So you're translating it differently, and I think correctly, more to there is no shot, but more to the plain meaning of the text than this translation gives it. But ki could mean a lot of things. And you're translating ki here as when, and they translate it as because, which I think a lot of modern Hebrew speakers would sort of like go to. So if you could just like maybe elucidate where that's popping out from for you.
Yeah, so in modern Hebrew, ki is almost only because. In ancient biblical Hebrew, ki is both because and when and for and while. I think in this particular case, for me, the when and the because are essentially synonyms because what the wonderful things he does. Whatever is happening in the Mishkan, God is filling it. And while that's happening, because it's happening, Moshe, for a reason which is inscrutable to me, can't enter, right? Because you can imagine the exact opposite. When God came down from the heavens to fill the presence of the temple, stores open, come meet God. Isn't that the point? Right? Aren't we beckoning God in with our korbanot and our prayer? Like, God, come, my heart is open. But now we're learning God is there doing the very indwelling for which the Mishkan was built. Moshe can't go in. And if Moshe can't go in, al achat kama b'chama, how much more likely is it that the Israelites can't go in? And then, in case we misunderstood verse 35, but uvehalot hanan me'al mishkan, but once the cloud rose up and was no longer inhabiting and dwelling upon the Mishkan, yisu b'nei Yisrael b'chol masehem, the Israelites could continue on their travels. So once again, it suggests that when God was present, two things that are not necessarily logical extensions of what has happened up until now were the case. Number one, no one could enter. Number two, they were paralyzed. They couldn't move, right? They were stuck. And remember, the whole purpose of the desert wandering is movement, getting towards the land of Israel. When God is there, they can't make progress towards their destination. But once God removes God's self, now they can continue. But if the cloud didn't go up and do aliyah and rise above the Mishkan, below yisu ad yom ha'aloto, they could not travel until the day upon which God removed God's self from the tabernacle. And this is how the book of Exodus ends. Ki anan Adonai ala Mishkan yomam. The cloud of God was on the Mishkan during the day, by which I think we're almost intentionally reading that as during the day, nearly every day. Ve'esh tia laila bo. At nighttime, what we're calling the Anan became a fire, because you can't see a cloud at nighttime. Le'enei kol beit Yisrael b'chol masehem. In the eyes of the entire house of Israel throughout their traveling. It is not an impossible read of these verses to say that the greatest obstacle to the Israelites reaching the land of Israel was God's presence among them. Now, maybe that's intentional because God is delaying this experience so that the generation of the golden calf can die out, and the generation of the spies that's going to happen coming up is going to die out. But right now, it seems that in order to have communion with God here, you have to prevent your progress in getting to the place that God is actually asking you to go. So I find it really interesting that the book of Shemot, and this is just pshat right now, because we haven't even looked at commentators, ends in that at least single, if not double paradox. Last thing I'll say before I open to Rabbi Chorny, the book of Genesis, Breshit, ends with the pre-Mosaic Israelite people who at that point are just a tribe, stuck in Egypt. Not yet, they don't know yet they're going to be enslaved, but they're in the place from which it's going to be possible to, very hard to extract themselves. And the book of Exodus, interestingly, ends with the people in some ways stuck in a hug with God that actually got in the way of their going where they were supposed to be going. That's my intro.
Awesome. What version of Sepharia did you have in 19 when you gave your senior sermon?
Yeah, it's the version of knocking on my colleague's door and saying, "Do you have this book? Because I need it."
Oh, I also used to knock on my colleague's door in what was called Goldsmith and yell at them for having stolen it off of my shelf, usually without my permission. And it was always the volume that I needed. Yes. Always. Okay, I'm going to screen share a version of those verses that is all in a paragraph form, so you can look at it together. And I'd like to hear, what are your kushiot, as Rabbi Schatz frames it? What are the questions that arise in your mind when you are looking at these verses all together? What are those big questions? I'll collect them up a little. I'll take a little note. So jump in. You can unmute yourselves. Karen.
It kind of makes sense and it kind of doesn't. That if God is there, you're not moving. And it is being awestruck. And but why can't Moses go in is my big question.
Yeah. Why can't Moses go in?
Not
Great.
Not nice.
It's not nice. Isn't the whole point that Moses is supposed to be able to go in? It's called the Ohel Moed. It's supposed to be the tent of meeting. If you can't go in, it's going to be hard to meet. Okay, Renee.
So it says that when the cloud lifted, the Israelites were able to set out, but it doesn't say anything about Moses. Did he set out? Did he lead them out?
Great. Is Moses automatically included in those Israelites? He does seem to be referenced separately. Is he always going with them? Right. Is he not? That's very interesting. All right. Anyone else? What seems challenging? What begs the question? Yeah, Michael.
Yeah, it does seem to indicate sort of a difference in the people from one of where they had just come out of slavery to one of a people that is on the move, even though at times they can't move, maybe because of the presence of God in the tabernacle, but they are moving as a people. And of course, I'm reminded of something that Rabbi Kligfeld said in I think in the final Parasha, in a devar he did in the final Parasha before Simchas Torah, where when Moshe was not allowed to go in to the promised land, he tried to go in, but he didn't. He he didn't wasn't allowed. And Rabbi Kligfeld, I think, talked about his grandfather or great-grandfather, I think. Anyway, the idea of when somebody knows they, as Moshe, he became much more humble through this experience. I think he steps away in a sense, and also here, where his job was to get the Israelites to know that they needed to move on their own, and they needed to act. And in a sense, they did act. They all brought things to build to create the Mishkan.
Yeah. Sometimes, Michael, I think about the existential cycle of when we are in the Torah's story. So if you follow me for just a second,
yes, sure.
Moshe has already been up to the mountain and received Torah, by the way, twice, right? Because he shattered the tablets and then goes back up there. So Moshe has now heard all of the Torah. So Moshe knows how the Torah ends. Now, it depends on who you ask. Later rabbinic commentators will say that's not really where the Torah story starts. The Torah story really starts after that, and so the received Torah story starts later. This all gets a little bit meta and confusing, but if you really want to take it from that angle and take the timeline of the story, the chronology of the story like that, then Moshe really knows. Moshe knows that he's not destined to go, even before later in the story when we hear the conversation happen between Moshe and God when he's told that he's not going to go into the land. It's really us being told at that point that Moshe is not going into the land. And so that kind of reinforces to me your point, which is perhaps that's what's going on there. Let's hear from Bonnie, and then I'll come back to you, Karen.
So if every time they traveled, they did have to disassemble the tabernacle, so the cloud couldn't really be in it when they did that. And I think that the cloud stayed with them, even though that it wasn't within the tabernacle. So I don't know if that's a question, but it's a thought I had.
Right. So what happens to the cloud? And as Rabbi Kligfeld described it, right, the fluffy part, well, you didn't say fluffy, but I was thinking fluffy. The fluffy part and the not fluffy part of it. What happens to those parts of it? I'm thinking of you didn't. I thought this. I don't know if you said this out loud. I'll have to listen back to the recording, or you can tell me. But I was thinking kaved. I'm thinking about like the weightiness of the cloud, right? So it's like the fluffiness and the weightiness as I watch actually some of these heavier rain clouds pass closer to us.
I didn't say that, but yes, that was the thought.
Yeah. And so the idea is like, what happens to those as the physical deconstruction of that, what's the word I'm thinking of, that modular and necessarily portable Mishkan is being deconstructed and then reconstructed? Is it, what's the following that's happening there? So I also have that question. I think it's a good question. Karen and then Gary.
Might this have anything to do with a kind of meaning? When we're with God, some of you may go every day to the shul, and some of us may not. And I'm just wondering if it has anything resting and.
Sure. Yeah. And I will add a question to your question. Your question prompts a question for me, which is, why is there no other obvious timeline given to us in this verse? There doesn't seem to be a rhyme or a reason other than when that cloud lifted, that was giving them the time. It doesn't give us a Shabbatiness, a rhythm. Right? Shabbat is necessarily rhythmic. Okay, great. Gary?
Is it on? Yeah. My question is, how big is the cloud? Is it exactly over the tabernacle? Is it it goes bigger? Because it could be, tabernacle could just literally be this, so people could be outside the cloud and to have a sunny day, and be inside the tabernacle and just not be able to see anything. I just don't know how big that area is.
So I'm so glad you asked that question, and we'll take that as the last kushya, because even though I'm going to toss this back to Rabbi Kligfeld for the first shot at giving commentary if he wants this, one of the commentaries that I would like to speak to is the take both the Ramban and also from a Midrash Tanhuma, which here is not quoted by Rashi, but often Rashi pulls from that ancient Midrash, collection of Midrash, that speaks to that idea of sort of the size of that cloud. So I'm glad you asked, because they had those same questions and I had that question too. So I don't know, Rack. Did you get a book off your shelf and find something interesting, or did you have something in mind?
I wanted to see how Everett Fox, who has one of the more lyrical translations of the Torah into English, doesn't mean it's accurate, it's just beautiful, sure. Dealt with these verses. And they're sort of interesting. So I'll share them with you. Safari has Everett Fox's commentary, but not his actual translation. So I can actually share the screen here. And then I'll share with you some of my thoughts about what I think these verses might be telling us across the century. The way Everett Fox treats Yud Hey Vav Hey is by rendering it into English letters as YHWH. And I don't even know how to say that out loud, so I'm just going to say God. I'm just going to say God when I get to that part of the. Now the cloud covered. Yeah, so you can listen to this while you're comparing what Rabbi Chorny is sharing. Now the cloud covered the tent of appointment. He calls it a tent of appointment rather than we say the tent of meeting. It's actually a good translation because moed is from the word ya'ad, which means something like something appointed or something indicated. And the glory, he goes glory, not presence or heavy. The glory of God filled the dwelling. He calls tabernacle, Mishkan, not tabernacle, because what the hell is a tabernacle? He calls it dwelling because the word Mishkan has as its root Shin Kaf Nun, which means to dwell. So he just calls it the dwelling. Moshe was not able to come into the tent of appointment for. He turns the key not into a because or a when, but for. For is kind of like because. For the cloud took up dwelling on it, and the glory of God filled the dwelling. Whenever the cloud goes up, he does an interesting thing here and turns it into like an ongoing present tense. Whenever the cloud goes up from the dwelling, which is an interesting choice because it's uve ha'alot. Ha'alot is it's built from the word Allah, which means to go up, but it's an interesting form. It's not quite a gerund like going up. That would be aliyah. It's like in the going up.
And in the going up.
And in the going up. And in the going up of the cloud, which is rendered by Reverend Fox as whenever the cloud goes up from the dwelling. So he turns it from like a gerund noun into like a present tense concept. The children of Israel march on upon all their marches. If the cloud does not go up, they do not march on until such time as it does go up. For the cloud of God, Everett Fox now puts in parentheses the word is, because there's no present tense of the verb to be in the Torah. For the cloud of God is over the dwelling by day, and fire is by night in it, before the eyes of all the house of Israel upon all their marches. I just wanted to share with you as another way of rendering what do I think these verses are all about. So that's really the question for any Jew to be considering, not just what the words mean, but what's the religious meaning for us as we contend with them generations. Listen, I think that there is something paradoxical, maybe intentionally so, about our seeking out intimacy and indwelling with the Holy One. Because on the one hand, when it happens, if it happens, it's exaltation and it's ecstasy and it's spiritual ascent and it's why we're involved in this whole thing called religion. And when it happens, it sometimes can stultify progress in society and even in life itself. You might know people who are so impassioned with their experience of the divine in their life that it actually gets in the way of marching forward. And I find in these verses a important teasing kind of hint that suggests we both want you to go to the Mishkan and meet God there, and we also want you to get out of there. Because it's actually not until you get out of there that might happen because God has left, that you're able to actually look in front of you and decide where to march forward. Right? And so the fact that sometimes when God, as it were, removes God's presence from your life, it might not be a punishment. It might be an indication that you've done enough navel gazing, and now it's time to march towards a promised land, whether it's a geographic promised land or a conceptual promised land, right? Even I, and even Rabbi Chorny, who are rabbis and teachers and meditators, right? It's not how we spend 24 hours a day. Right? And I actually find that people in the religious world who are just mystics or just yeshiva bachers who are doing almost nothing other than trying to meet God in the Mishkan, they might be getting something out of religious life that I'm not getting, but they're actually also missing something out of life that I'm getting. And I at least choose to see that in these verses. Choose to see the book of Exodus ending with God saying, you want me, but not too much of it. You want me to be close to you, but not perpetually. And part of the relationship with me is separating from me so that you can go on with your lives. That's one of the things that it means to me as I consider it now. And it's actually, in some ways, not that dissimilar from how I understood it 23 years ago when I was sermonizing about it.
Before I jump in to respond to that idea, it looks like Karen wants to respond to that idea, and far be it from me to stand between Karen, Cass, sharing, and all of us, because I actually really want to hear what you have to say.
Well, it reminded me of God saying, you're doing my work on earth, so go do my work. So it was, don't stay just here, but get out there and do what I want you to do.
It's beautiful, and kind of a cousin to the idea that it reminded me of as you were sharing that idea, which is, it's also a reminder of who's in charge in that relationship. Because one of the things that religious fanaticism, or rather obsession with religious ritual, can do is to give us the false impression that we're the ones who are the ultimate power, who have the ultimate control, who are supposed to have the power, the authority. It's one of the things that I despise the most about our system of kashrut in this world, or over religious authorities who would deny people identity, that kind of a thing. And God's being in control of the journeys that the Israelites are taking, sort of a reminder of, I'm still in control here. Right? We just said the Israelites are in charge of celebrating their own seasons, right? They received Rosh Chodesh. They get to decide appoint their own times and seasons, and they get to appoint their own priests and everything. But you move when I say you move. So I like that idea, Rabbi Kligfeld, that like there's a religious fanaticism that could so easily get us thinking that we're the ones who are in charge. Like, oh, we're in charge now, where we have our autonomy, but it's sort of a tamping of that autonomy. And it looks like Michael has something to say too.
Well, I just wanted to amplify a little something that Rabbi Kligfeld said, and that is that there is a time for learning, and a time for examining, and a time for closeness to God, and I'm just very happy that I am part of a congregation that is doing that, like we're doing now, but then also coming up to Shabbat, having involvement with the refugees tonight, and after Havdalah, and the point is that is action in the world, and how we have to. And I think the learning makes us think about that in deliberate ways, and makes us, in a sense, better stewards of what God wants us to do in this world, and actualizes our own self, our own unique selves in doing that. And that is the example that Temple Beth Am is celebrating in a meaningful way tonight.
Right. And Michael, I will say in full candor, there are those in our community who feel as you do that balance is just right. And there are those in our community who feel that we do that too much. And there are those in our community who feel that we do it too little, right? There's some who say, like, enough of you is sitting in the round and singing harmonies. Go out there and change the world. Like the purpose of being involved in the religious community is so that your praying and your study will go make you be activists for the good. And others are saying, my activism is elsewhere. I come to shul to study and to pray. Like that's what I want out of my Jewish identification, not to be told when and how to be an activist, because there's so many different things for which it's proper to be activating for. And I will also say that, listen, we're living in a time where it's both the case that there seems to be one cascading catastrophe after another at a pace that just seems abnormal. And it's also the case that we're living in an era where we're aware of every worldwide catastrophe as it's happening, which means that there's an impression that there might be more of it. I don't know, maybe there were terrible things happening every day in 1729, but the people in whatever was Ghana was called back then were not aware what was happening in whatever, Minnesota was called back then, right? So we're also like aware of every individual thing. And because we're aware of all that, like you could make the legitimate argument then that every moment of leisure and every moment of not contributing to helping to assuage and fix the brokenness of the world is rank selfishness and self-indulgence, right? How could I ever justify going to see a movie when there's a raging war in Ukraine and we haven't yet, solved the pandemic and add your thing to the list, right? And I would think that it's just no healthy way to go through life. Only always focused on the very worthy things that one could be focusing on. And I'm seeing the same thing in these texts here. And that doesn't mean that's what the text means. It's just what they mean to me, that one could make the argument, if I'm a Jew and I'm a religious Jew and I'm a God Jew, then why would I ever do anything other than stay in the Mishkan and wait for God to meet me there? Why would I ever leave the sanctuary? And I had the Torah saying, sometimes you need to leave the sanctuary, or God's going to leave the sanctuary saying nothing's happening. Like the restaurant's closed. Go to your next encampment and I'll meet you there. Right. Otherwise, like if we were writing the Torah, as it were, right, we could say, well, there's no reason for God to leave. God can hang around as we're making our progress, and God will, we'll be aware of God's presence as we're walking through the desert. And the Torah says, no, God removes God's self, and it's only upon that removal that progress is allowed to be made, which to me suggests sometimes the focus of a God-focused life and a God-driven life is a separation from God.
Let's give Bonnie a chance to speak up, and then I'm going to share, but I want enough time not only to share, but also to hear your responses to what I share. So we'll give Bonnie some space, and then I'll share some other commentaries.
So when I was listening, I thought of what I'm going through right now, and that is my period of mourning for Larry, and I related to the idea of the cloud and the koved of God being with me at some times. Especially, I've been going to Minyan every morning, and I also journal. I have a book on Kaddish where there's a quote of Jewish wisdom every day that I reflect on. And so during that time, it's as if that cloud is there, but I know that I have to just, at some point, I have to stop and find something in life to do with my time now, and get back to living, go on my journey like the Israelites. So that was what came to me.
I love that, Bonnie, because kind of like Everett Fox, you've brought it into the present tense, right? It's not just a rhythm of God's glory or of grief or whatever else might cloud over and then relieve us of that cloudiness from time to time. And we have to hope that we can have the kind of things in our life like journals or community or whatever else that can provide that kind of rhythmic relief from whatever that grief or whatever else for any of us might be the heavy thing in our life. I'm going to put in the chat here a collection of sources in case people want to take a look at them. I would rather look at your faces and share with you verbally, also because this is becoming a podcast. So I'll share the sheet such that people who are listening to the podcast can also listen. I want to share with you 2 kushiot that many of our ancient texts seemed to have about this set of verses. So this set of verses we're focusing on because I don't think Rabbi Kligfeld has stopped thinking about them since his senior sermon. Mine was Vayigash. It was a lot easier, but I had to, if you think about the calendar, I had to do it a lot earlier in the year. So that was, I had less time in my senior year of rabbinical school to prepare for for my senior sermon. I was less refined. I'm a little afraid to look back at my senior sermon. Anyway, so we're looking at these verses, and they're not verses that I've spent all that much time on before, unlike some rabbis who are here. And I'm fascinated by 2 problems that, in particular, as I mentioned before, Ramban and Midrash Tanhuma have answers to. I don't know if you'll like the answers. I kind of like their answers. But one of the problems that we see is that there seems to be a contradiction with all of these verses about God's being in the Ohel Moed or not in the Ohel Moed. If God has to leave the Ohel Moed in order for Moses to go in there, how are they meeting? What exactly is happening here? There seems to be a bit of a contradiction. And if you go further up in the Parsha, there also seems to be a contradiction of other verses as to when Moshe is entering, when God leaves. There's a very unclear situation about who is leaving when, and not just for whomever brought up this issue, is Moshe, when Renee did, is Moshe included in the Israelites, but also, if God is always leaving the tent of meeting, how is it a tent of meeting with God? That's one question. The other question is, if God is melo, if God is filling the tent of meeting, that seems to be a problem because then God is departing from the rest of the world. Isn't that a problem? Okay, so 2 answers that I really liked. First of all, both of these answers speak to me in a way that I think we can all take into tefillah with us, prayer with us. Shocker, I'm a cantor, so this goes right to tefillah for me. We all are familiar, everyone who's on this, who is engaging in this right now, I'm certain are familiar with the line, which I believe Rabbi Kligfeld comes from Yechezkel, Kadosh, 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 Adonai Tzvaot, Meloch Haaretz Kevodo. I think it's found a couple times in Tanakh, but yeah, Yechezkel. And in that line, we have holy, 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 or glory, sacred, sacred, sacred. Adonai Tzvaot is Adonai, the God of hosts. Meloch Haaretz Kevodo. The whole world is filled with God's kavod, this kavod, right? And this answer that Ramban gives, Nachmanides gives to what the heck is the deal with God filling the Mishkan, the tabernacle, helps me with that line too, which is that, it's Isaiah. Thank you. I knew it was a prophet. That was pretty, okay. So, no, it is Isaiah. Okay. So, Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh. So, Meloch Haaretz Kavodo. Here we have Melo, the tent of meeting. Filling the tent of meeting. How is it that God isn't departing from the rest of the world? It's because it's Melo Kivodo. What is filling the tent of meeting? Not God, but God's kavod. It's the kavod itself, which seems to be an entity separate and apart from God. Just as we can experience the Shekhinah as an aspect of God, Ramban, who is not much of a mystic in most of Ramban's commentary, it would seem, though I'm not an expert, has this rather mystical approach from my perspective, that the kavod of God is a different aspect of God than God's self. And so it's actually the kavod of God, the glory of God, this kavodiness of God that's filling the tent and not God's self. To extend that concept, what about the fact that God seems to be filling this tent of meeting, or this kavod is filling the tent of meeting? Where's God the rest of the time? If you followed Ramban's, if you follow Ramban's explanation, you might say, well, it's God. Ramban might answer that problem, that kushya, by saying, well, God is everywhere else and God's kavod is in the tent, right? But Ramban didn't ask that question. Midrash Tanhuma answers this question instead and gives it as a story, which I love because I grew up in San Diego and I used to go down to La Jolla to the caves, and it tells a story of a sea that fills sea caves. And in the Midrash, the image is painted of a sea that comes up in high tide and fills caves. And it says that the sea is no lesser for filling the caves, but the cave can be filled. It reminds me of what Rabbi Kligfeld and many of us, I'm sure in echoes of Rabbi Kligfeld, say to parents who have a second or a third or a fourth child, which is that we wonder how is it possible that our heart could get any bigger and make space to love yet another child, and yet it does, and yet it does, and yet it does. There's always more room for love. God's infinitude makes space for that. Right. And so when God would fill the tent of meeting, we have to imagine whether it's the kavod, you want to buy into Ramban's painted idea, or you want to just go with the idea that Midrash Tanhuma is painting, which is that God is filling that cave of the Ohel Moed and also still filling the world. We have to buy into the infinitude of God, that God can be there and also be everywhere else. Now, I'll just add one more image, and then I'd love to hear your reactions to this. I also find myself as a parent regularly saying to one of my children, just because my attention appears to be with one of my kids doesn't mean that my love has departed from you or that my attention has departed from you to my other child. It's a very important and difficult thing to convey, and will probably take a lifetime of parenting to convey, but that's really hard. And as an only child, I never had to experience that as a recipient, but as a parent of two kids, I am constantly navigating that concept. And I'm sure people could think about that in terms of supervision and reporting mentees or folks who work underneath them in a work system. You know, just because we're not right there and present and witnessing in that moment doesn't mean that our love or appreciation or respect has departed from that person who we're not with. So I appreciate the idea of an infinitude of presence, even when that presence isn't felt in the same fullness that might be observable in the same way. I love reactions, questions, pushback. Any thoughts? Rabbi Kligfeld, you can respond to.
I agree with you.
You agree with the ancient rabbis I quoted?
I agree with the part that you were talking about in terms of the love of children and whatnot, multiple children and or multiple grandchildren.
Well, I think the way what you said is beautiful, because we never know what we're going to be presented with on any given day, and how we have, and what guides us is something that we're guided to respond with love to how, and we have to respond. It's our response that counts, and you're responding to something needed by one of your children, and expressing that to the other, that you're not going to be absent. And that, in a sense, I see where the Parasha and what we've been studying this hour rings true to that, because and from the other ideas that you've floated with, the presence is there, but also it's an infinity kind of thing.
It may be, depending on one's perspective, the apex of heresy or the apex of religiosity to say that one of the most important things that a person can learn about what the Torah says about a relationship with God is something about our relationship with other people. And now the reason why that might be heresy is because someone might say, wait, no, this is a religious modality. Don't try to turn God into a metaphor. God is God. And so don't try to say, well, I don't know how to make some of the God stuff, but this really helps me thinking about a relationship with a spouse or a friend or a child. But one could also make the argument that in addition to or to reify that which our tradition says about the God concept, I try to live that out in my relationship with others. So, for instance, the philosopher Martin Buber, when he wrote about I, thou in German, I forgot what it sounds like in German, not that I would understand it. And
it sounds funny, whatever it is.
The notion that our relationship with most things and with most people are as an it, right? An it meaning an object, something from which I can get something, right? Whereas our intent with God is to be in a moment of I, thou. That's a clunky English version of probably a similarly clunky philosophical German saying that I want to turn to God and you're not an it. It's not because it's not a Misha Berach. I'm not asking you to heal me, but you're a full you. You're a full thou. You're an other in an intimate way in a relationship with me. And of course, the paradox being the moment that you realize that you might be in an I, thou relationship with God, the moment is over because once you're analyzing it, the bubble has burst. So I think I kind of know sometimes maybe when I might be in that kind of a moment, sort of with a divine being or my conception of a divine being. But I certainly know when I'm in that moment with a friend, colleague, spouse, or child, right? And so I find it to be a great acting out of religiosity to say, what my tradition invites me to think about in my relationship with the divine plays out in one of those moments when I'm with my child and I've forgotten that I'm in a moment. We're almost one person in that moment. And as soon as I realize it, it's broken and I'm analyzing it. But for 3 seconds, we were a unified soul, right? And we were in an I, thou. So similarly, either these sources are supposed to be teaching us something exclusively about the religious experience and what it means to be in relationship with, but sometimes even suffocated by God. And we're not supposed to be creating a therefore in terms of our relationship with children, friends, and spouses. Or maybe that's exactly what we're supposed to be doing, right? Are there, is it the case that the only way that, work on the clergy projects at Temple Beth Am can happen if Rabbi Chorny and I are in the same room or in the same Zoom and talking about it and engaging, and each of our presences are filling the space, and there's no way to get things done if that doesn't happen. And sometimes there's also no way of getting things done unless we separate from each other and stop talking about it and going to do it, to make a very prosaic example, right? So I don't know if I'll ever resolve the question of whether or not it's more or less religious to be thinking about applications of some of these God images in our everyday interactions.
Yeah, I don't know either, but I know that I am constantly doing that. I'm constantly grafting it because I am exploring my relationship with God through the acting out of better relationships on a horizontal plane, to be kind of crass about it. Only crass because I don't believe that my relationship with God is strictly vertical. And I agree, Michael. I think we're both talking about the relationship with others being a reflection of the way that I'm grappling with my relationship with God. Grappling, really. By the way, it's ich and du. And I also found out that I and Thou is a progressive rock band, because when I looked it up, that's what I got. So the more you know, something new I learned today. I have an interesting note kind of to end on, like something really curious that I found in the Talmud. Should we end on like a curiosity from the Talmud? Something really interesting. It's on the source sheet.
They end with a bow.
They end with a what?
A bow.
A bow?
A bow. They tie it all together.
Oh. Well, I don't know if I have a bow. Okay, I can try to make it tied into a bow.
Parshat bow. The beginning of Shmo. You're confused.
That's exactly what I was thinking, and I was trying to figure it out. Where I was like, "Is Bo? Wasn't that President Obama's dog?" Like, my brain went so many places. Okay.
And Bo ends with a bashalach. And what were you just shaking baking, Renee? What were you doing? Were you like churning butter?
I spent the class preparing for Shabbat. I was shaking a dressing that I just made.
Like your hands were going through the Golden Gate Bridge as you were. It was the weirdest image. There you go.
Rabbi, ask her to now twirl her challah.
But I haven't gotten to the challah yet.
I haven't gotten to the challah. Okay.
I haven't finished the cooking.
I haven't
first,
talked long enough. We haven't talked long enough, which is the first time that's ever happened. Okay, Talmud and Yoma. So, like, what if actually Moshe were allowed to enter the tent of meeting and we are getting the verse all wrong, says the Talmud in Yoma. Okay, so the rabbis in Yoma want to resolve also this issue where they say it just can't be. Right? It simply can't be that, in fact, I think I'll screen share for this last bit, that they're really bothered by this idea that it would be that Moshe wouldn't be allowed into the tent of meeting, maybe ever. They're really bothered by it. And so they say, what could it be that it teaches us? So Rabbi Zerika raises this contradiction, has an issue between verses before Rabbi Elazar. And some have the story a different way. It is written in one place that Moshe was not able to go in. V'lo yachol Moshe lavo el ohel moed. We now know what that means. Ki shachan alav ha'anan. Because the cloud was shachaning, it was dwelling upon it. Uchtiv vayavo Moshe bitoch ha'anan. There's also a verse way back in the 24th verse that says that Moshe somehow entered a cloud, and they don't like this. One seems to really contradict the other. So they said it must be that Moshe was allowed to enter in the cloud. So what could it mean that he wasn't allowed to enter? It must be he wasn't allowed to enter without not only the invitation of God, but God bringing Moshe in. Milamed she'tifaso hakadosh baruch hu leMoshe vehevio be'anan. That he would grab Moshe, that God would grab Moshe and bring Moshe into the cloud when it was time. And I'm rereading this now in light of what you said, Rabbi Kligfeld, in your read of the verses that we have been looking at for the last hour, which is on the more extreme end of piety and what it can mean to involve oneself too far without having the necessary cloud to descend and not be pulled in. And I think that the question is, what are those moments when we are being grabbed by the Holy One or by our holy community to be pulled all the way in further than we otherwise do? Most of the time we are in a regular rhythm with our religious piety. And sometimes we are being pulled right into it. And I think of those being pulled in moments as the being pulled in sometimes involuntarily through the death of a loved one. I think of being pulled in as voluntarily saying yes to being a gabbai for a minyan or being on the library minyan committee or saying yes to being on the board. It's sort of that like being grabbed by the neck and pulled into the cloud. And I think that you get pulled in sometimes, and not necessarily by God, but by, maybe this is heresy, I don't know, but being pulled in by the communal representation of what God's dwelling is on earth now, which is in the shape of a community. And so I think we have to look for those grabbing moments when we are pulled right in to the holy cloud where you don't really think you can enter. Oh, that space is closed for me, but we're pulled in and grabbed by the neck anyway and welcomed to be a part of sacred conversation.
You have been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am Los Angeles, go to tbala.org.